Thank you, everyone that's already here with us today to join me and Drew from Mammoth Growth to talk about inheriting data debt. Pleased to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Just going to go through a quick a few housekeeping items before we go into introductions, and I'll throw the ball then over to you, Drew, for a better introduction of yourself. So to get the most out of today's session, we want you to make it interactive. So don't be a stranger in the chat. Share your thoughts. We want your perspective. You can also comment on YouTube if you're watching this after the fact. Feel free to use the Q&A and emojis and whatever. Definitely ask questions. We've activated the Q&A. If you're thinking it, someone else is probably thinking it as well. We also had some questions sent over to us in advance, so we might also dip into those a little bit. Keep the conversation going with us after this. You can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, X, whatever, and join our community, the right track.app, if you want to have follow-up conversations about anything we are talking about here today. And please call out if you have any audio or video issues, if you're not seeing us or hearing us, or something's not working, if the Q&A is not working, just go ahead and let us know. So with that, today we are talking about inheriting data debt. This is the position of most of the people who have problems of data quality. It's been my experience that if you care or have strong opinions about data quality, it's because you have sort of been thrown into the deep end of the pool and you're sort of dealing with something. When we say inherited in this case, it might be because, you might have been with a company for a really long time, and then all of a sudden you're sort of dealing with something that you and other people in the company have been building. So we're not here to play the blame game today. We're sort of here to dive into why this can happen and how you might be able to get started in climbing the mountain of fixing the data debt that has occurred. And I am really excited to have with me here today Drew from Mammoth Growth. I'll let you introduce yourself more, but the reason why I'm particularly excited about this is I know that Mammoth all of the time gets thrown into the deep end of the pool with a lot of data debt. And so I am personally extremely excited to hear your perspective on exactly this subject. So over to you, Drew, for an intro.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. This is going to be a really fun conversation. My name is Drew Beaupre. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Mammoth Growth. And I'll just quickly talk a little bit about Mammoth Growth real briefly. Sorry for the tabs. So we've been founded in 2015. Have a lot of different engagements. We work in a lot of different areas, and two main areas is like sort of the MarTech space, event-driven product behavioral analytics, but then also custom data warehouses and data pipelines. The really interesting thing is the intersection between those two things, and I think that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. And just real brief overview of some of the clients that we work with. We work at pretty much every scale, and we have seen almost every possible issue out there, but we're always surprised, which is why we keep doing it, because we always want to find that new challenge, that new problem that we can go out and solve, and that's why we do what we do. We love it.
Yeah, nice. Thank you so much, Drew. So maybe let's just start by defining what data debt is. Can you? Let me throw the ball over to you. We're talking about data debt. Would you mind defining what we're talking about? What is data debt? What does it mean? Why is it such a problem?
Yeah, I was trying to think of like a nice, concise definition of what it really is, because there's a lot of different ways you could define it. Just like financial debt, they're not all created equal. I can make choices, and maybe I know I'm going to do something that's going to limit myself, or I'm going to inherit some piece of debt, or I'm creating a piece of debt. But I know I'm doing it consciously, and it's going to allow me to go fast. And I have the opportunity cost outweighs, that particular choice. And so to me, like that kind of debt is like it's intentional. It's okay, and you already have a plan to deal with it in the future and to pay it down. Whereas other kinds of debt is cumulative and crippling, and it can be we have seen, years of people's efforts have to be thrown away and start from scratch because there's no, it's almost like you're declaring bankruptcy on your tech stack. There's just no way out of it, and it's cheaper just to start from scratch. So I was thinking about the definition, and I think it's any time, any effort spent not driving towards business value, not driving towards either new features that are going to drive growth in your users, or uh, new insights that are going to drive decisions at the executive level or at the management level. If you're not doing those things, you're incurring some kind of debt, because your time's not being spent on the things that are really valuable to the business.
That's very interesting. Yeah, exactly. And so you're thinking when you're spending too much time on just cleaning up stuff instead of actually figuring out what's happening in the data, that is you dealing with debt.
Absolutely. And so well, if you are creating I have seen a SQL case statement that had about 20 nested case statements inside of it, and it filled up an entire screen. If you're building things like that, you're creating future problems anytime someone has to go and change anything, because you're never going to be able to do it successfully. But if you have to do it in the first place, that's someone else's choice that they've made upstream, that you're now having to compound the problem.
Yeah, I think this here we are sort of at the key of the core of the problem here. I'm going to take a step back, and I did not introduce myself. I'm going to do that now. I'm Steph. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Avo. Sometimes I forget to do this. The reason why I'm here and so extremely passionate about this is I've been in data science for over a decade. And with a stop in genetics, I went over to product analytics at a gaming company called QuizUp, and I did inherit a data debt. Examples of what I mean here is when I was trying to look at just literally how many people played games every day, played a game every day. I had to go and join 7 different versions of like a game started analytics event to be able to count the total. And I think this is exactly what you're talking about. And when it's like 2,000 lines, that's because you're not only joining maybe the game table, you're also trying to link together the attributes of each of the event with the attribute of the other event. And you're fetching some things where you're enriching. And this is sort of the essence of the problem. And we ended up building these internal tools and processes to solve this problem at the root, at the source of where the data is created, as a cross-functional collaboration between the data producers and the data consumers, rather than having to be in reactive damage control like that all the time. And I think this is something that Drew, you and I are really aligned on, because it is way more expensive for any organization to be in this reactive damage control mode than invest a little bit in upfront data management. And so, okay, when you're a company and you've reached the point of having a 2,000 line SQL query where you are it's a query that probably has to live somewhere because there is a lot of upstream data debt happening. Can you maybe talk a little bit through the process of what had to happen for that to occur? Like what has to happen? What happened upstream so that people end up in this situation? Just describe it maybe for us.
You know, the simplest answer I think is because it was tolerated. Now I'm not advocating everyone go out and start like, you know, creating like an adversarial relationship. You know, what I'm actually quite interested in what you said about bringing together all the stakeholders in order to solve the problem upstream that you had. And to me, like that's the essence of the real solution to the problem is actually making sure that everyone understands and everyone's actually invested in making sure that the job that they're doing, or they see the value in the work that they're doing when they're creating sort of the measurements or the instrumentation. A lot of, you know, I'm not going to speak for all front-end developers, but every front-end developer I've ever worked with hates writing analytics code. They hate writing the instrumentation. They hate it. And so, you know, great tools, usually allow for the most seamless and um, intuitive way of actually instrumenting your application. And so any tool that makes that easier for the front end developer will just inherently, you know, result in much better results. But then as like, you know, as a team, you know, everyone in the company is a team. And as a team, you can also do a lot of good by getting them on board and like showing them the value of that code that they're writing and how that code actually affects the company. Um, but if you don't do that and you ultimately are getting minimum compliance, we'll call it, and you get the data after it's been in, you know, it's been in you know, the engineer's work queue or their sprint backlog for weeks and weeks and weeks. You're getting pressure in order to deliver the reports that you're supposed to be delivering or solving the problems that you're supposed to be solving. And you get it, and it's just not quite right. And you accept it. You just say, well, whatever, I'll just, you know, whatever. Now that's the slippery slope. And you do that the first time and it's fine, right? You got to move fast. Now that I was alluding to that conscious choice. Now, if you had then kicked up a, you know, another fix and it goes in their backlog, and then once it's released, then you can undo your change, that's fine. But if you don't do that because you're going fast, and you do that again and again and again, you just keep adding because you've already created a placeholder where you're going to put the garbage. You know, you compound that over 6 months, 12 months, and you start to really get this really painful thing that no one wants to touch. Now you've crossed a chasm where the tipping
Yes.
point where no one wants to touch it anymore. Don't touch that.
Mm-hmm.
And now you can't undo it. It's there.
Yeah. Yeah. This is you're talking about like sort of an SQL, like something starts as a quick fix of there are now two events that we have to cover to understand this single user action. And it starts as a quick fix SQL query, maybe to just combine those. And then it sort of grows into something more, and it grows into something more, and it grows into something more, because people keep shipping iterations of the product and product analytics or the event-based data, so that you have to grow the query. And at some point, you just don't want to make or touch it with a stick, like fix it
don't
in
even look at it.
post.
Don't even look at it.
Yeah,
Oh,
and it's balloons
party.
for that. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's
And it's not even on the database side. Oh, like I don't want to say that like, oh, this is only a SQL problem. I've seen this also in, you know, LCM tools, so downstream from your product analytics, your streaming analytics. And you need to build audiences, right? And we've all seen those segmentation or audience kind of like, you know, clicky rules, and you have about 30 different or conditions, and you're mixing and matching ors and ands, And now all of a sudden it becomes a Boolean algebra problem in order to figure out whether you need to, you know, add another property, or it's an or and you've got conflicting ors and ands. It's like it's impossible to test. So you still have you have that problem regardless of whether you're doing it in the database or you're using downstream tools. But it's the same source problem.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about what's at stake also, because we have briefly touched on the technical details of the problem. But I also like how you at Mammoth think about this. You come in as sort of like a data team as a service, and you figure out, or help people figure out what are you actually trying to do with the data, right? And what's at stake? Why do you do that, and why does it matter when you inherit this type of debt?
Well, from business leaders' perspective, what's at stake is running your business. Like, you cannot, if you don't trust the information in front of you, then you can't trust any decisions based off of those. And you need full trust in your underlying data. You need to, if you see a number, if you have any doubt in that number, you know, or the change over time, week over week of that number, if that number changes in the past, that's the worst, is when, you know, you get a call from the CEO and it's like, last month's number just changed. Why? And so from a business leader perspective, you've invested all this time and energy and resourcing in these data systems. And if you, at the end of the day, if you can't trust them, then it was kind of a like colossal waste of money. And it's just, so you can't afford not to invest in reliable data. And if you're not asking, well, what part of this cost in this project plan is measuring reliability, because you do have to measure reliability in order for you to have trust. You have to have some kind of quantification of the reliability of the data, and that's either through some kind of audit process against sources of truth or whatever. If you're not doing that, then you really can't trust the data. And so tooling is obviously a huge part of that, because otherwise it's just, you know, trust me. For the data practitioner, that trust me thing, if your data is not trustworthy, then your work is not trustworthy. And if you get to a point where you know your data is always trustworthy, anytime anyone questions it, you can show them, you become a linchpin. You become a trusted partner in a company's, you know, journey through being data driven. Without that, it's the alternative. You kind of run the risk of, you know, being the you know, that's been pretty harsh to call a liability of the company, but like, when companies are looking at reducing costs, that's going to be a really big factor. So again, everyone really can't afford not to be thinking about data reliability, and minimizing and addressing tech debt at the source is one of the key drivers for that.
How do you get started when you join? Because I know there's, for example, this fantastic case study on the Mammoth landing page or the website about the Mammoth collaboration with Calendly. And it has exactly these examples, which are always seemingly minor, but are actually pretty big, which is you know, we had all of these different event names to describe the same user action and the same property to describe. And it's something that seems so minor, but it's so big because people don't know that they are working with all of these different events to describe the same action. So they're either missing a lot of data, or they have to go through a lot of hoops to actually get the holistic picture. So that's the problem. That's the problem that we're sort of dealing with and talking about here. What's your first thing you do when you sort of enter that type of a situation?
Well, the first thing we start to do is we start to interview people, who are all the stakeholders involved, in the entire end to end. Getting their perspective, what is challenging for them. So seeking to understand is really the really first big major step. So we spend a lot of time doing interviews, one-on-ones, when we start an engagement, because we really need to understand what the landscape looks like.
Mm-hmm.
The second key step along the way, again, like if you start your journey from the wrong place, then you're going to be walking uphill the whole time. But if you start your journey in the right place, then you have a much easier time along the way. And so we always start with, what is the outcome? What are we trying to achieve? Not what's wrong, or, what did everyone do? Instead, it's like, okay, it could be that everyone was, chasing the wrong ball. What are we actually trying to move? What are we trying to change in the organization? That could be optimizing around, user conversions. It could be top of funnel optimizations. It could be, increasing average order values. Business, the leaders of a business have already figured out what they want to be optimizing around. So that's where we start.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, you just work backwards, or you work backwards. How do you measure that? What's the metric that goes into that thing that you want to affect? How do you currently measure it?
Can you give just an example so that we're talking about something tangible as a group?
Yeah. So let's say we want to reach out to customers who are at risk of churning. So, we've already acquired those customers, and we want to re-engage them using some kind of LCM tool. And that LCM tool is going to get a data feed from, some kind of CDP or, behavioral analytics platform service. And so the simple aspect of, like, okay, how do you define an at-risk customer? Like, how do you define
Mm-hmm.
that? Because
Yeah.
chances are no one's actually written it down on paper. And
And for
then the next step
context
is,
for everyone, LCM tool is lifecycle management.
thank you.
Where
So yeah, and
this is I'm speaking on behalf of the rest of the world outside the US who speaks in less acronyms and abbreviations.
and we use those tools in order to create workflows that automatically message and email existing clients per the journey. So when if you signed up for a service, you have probably received a series of targeted emails at the right time in order to help you in various ways. They'll either help you to engage in the product, or help you to know about new offers or whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. And for that, the reason why you need quality event-based data is, and I'm going to throw that over to you.
Oh, well, there's no do-overs. When you're dealing with tooling like that, there's no do-overs. If you get the wrong data in the system and the wrong emails are sent out at the wrong time to the wrong person with the wrong context, you can't claw that back. You can't fix the bug and push the release and everything's fixed. So if you make mistakes in that pipeline, uh, you, you sort of have lost, probably, I'm not gonna say you lost those customers, but you really lost the opportunity to engage with those customers.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this is sort of touched a little bit on why it is why the at the source part can be really important for some of these tools. I know you've also talked a little bit about I guess that's a similar thing, like generally around automatic segment generation. If a tool is offering you to automatically segment audiences based on your data, you really need that data to be reliable when it enters the tool, right? And an example of a tool that does that for you could be, for example, I believe Twilio has offerings like that, right?
For automatic audience building.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Anyway, okay, so this is great. Thank you so much for sharing sort of this is how you get started in general. I think this is applicable advice for people, even if they've been a part of the team for a long time and all of a sudden they sort of are feeling the need to deal with the debt. So either you're in that position or you're joining and you're sort of taking on the responsibility. There are multiple journeys to actually ending up with data debt in your lap.
So, you have the data debt in your lap. You really want to make change. The as a practitioner, the first thing or the best thing you can start to do is to build relationships.
Yeah, plus one on that.
It seems like, oh, let's just go and get the job done. But there's so many different touch points along the journey of, a user interaction on your website is triggering code, and it touches so many different hands in your organization along its way to get to that email that someone loads on their, when they get in their inbox and is compelled to click it. Ultimately that's the sort of the end result that you're trying to achieve. And there are so many hands that it touches. And so everyone along the way really has to understand the value in this and want to do it rather than feel like they have to do it, because you're going to be, they may fix it the one time, but then what happens on the next release and the next release and the next release? So every single time they release code, there's an opportunity for them to, it's not just about getting perhaps the event and the properties wrong. Arguably worse is it doesn't get sent at all, because then you have no knowledge that it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. And so this is a really great sort of first step, is the relationship building and interviews and figuring out what we're ultimately trying to do and then optimize the problem from that perspective. And what I took from your comment on that specifically also was like, don't start with what's wrong. Let's start with what's our objective. Can you maybe give an example of that sort of, this is not the journey that you want to go through? What do you mean by don't start with what's wrong?
I do this all the time, and I have to stop myself, is I just want to dive into the data. I just want to start to go and start to pull out all the wires. But the problem with that is then you don't know how to put them back together, or you kind of lose sight of the forest from the trees. And you can get just as lost chasing the wrong thing. At the top of the call, I was talking about my definition of debt, and that's spending your time on things that are not driving forward the business value. So one of the best things you can do in order to not compound on the debt is to really focus on the things that are going to drive business value. You can't fix everything. So focus on
you can't fix everything. Yeah. Sorry. So focus on go ahead.
Yeah, no. So focus on the things that are truly important that are going to drive value. And so then you have to ask the question, and maybe you're not the one to answer it. Maybe it's someone else. What has value? What is valuable?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, great. So, okay, let's dive a little bit better into what do we mean by sort of proactive data management rather than reactive damage control. And I see there are already questions flowing in about exactly this and sort of how can I, as a data practitioner, for example, empower other people in my organization to think that way as well. And let me give like maybe a quick anecdotal story about my journey at QuizUp and then what I've seen with businesses since then. I already mentioned that sort of I joined and it was a ton of mess already. Like we had like game started, start game, play button pressed, and all of those different versions of the events. And again, this is like seemingly minor, but it's actually major, because it's, it puts me in the position where I am the only person that really knows about all of these cases, which means I am the only person who can answer questions based on the data, which means nobody else can self-serve any type of information, which means nothing scales. It's just like, that's a terrible situation. So, okay, so how can we fix it? Well, we can start building a lot of pipelines that sort of fixes all of these things, and then build tools on top of the data after it's been fixed. And then just rely on continuing to build more and more and more and more of that kind of a mess. Or we can figure out, like, how might we consolidate the stuff that exists and sort of make sure we don't keep piling on top of it. And at QuizUp, what we ended up doing is sort of build these cross-functional collaboration meetings to define define the specs for each of the analytics release. And we built tools and processes to manage the definitions of the specs, and to make sure that the definitions were validated in code and sort of linked to the code, and that we were actually calling and triggering the events and all those things. And of course, fast forward a couple of years, I started another company, and then had the exact same problem again. Like, I know you've seen a ton of times, Drew. And at that point, I thought we would be able to buy a solution to fix the problem, but we were in the position of having to build it again. And that's the journey of then eventually starting Avo, of course. So that's the core of why we exist. We believe people are better off when they fix data quality at the source of where the data is created, and cross-functionally. And one of the things that I saw in this process is, when we started this cross-functional collaboration very early in the process, as early as, how do we define the metrics for the release? Like, how will we measure success? Well, let's try to impact day one retention based on whether people saw the chat screen or not, something like that. That sort of creates drive for developers to actually care about analytics. And I think what we saw at QuizUp is, we saw maybe one or two developers caring about data, and the rest of them thinking about it as a chore that they had to do for an analyst. To eventually, most of the developers actually cared about data and saw it as one of their most fundamental tool to build better products. But this really depended on sort of cultural shift. So I just want to sort of, after having set the stage, like, how have you dealt with this and thought about this and introduced this concept, having been through this journey with so many companies?
It mirrors so much of what you just said. The objective is that, if you can get everyone to really see the value and everyone excited about it, by default they're not, because they don't understand. It does, like, what does this do for me? And the, sort of the crux of it all, like, where, the heart of it all is really just having that very well articulated tracking plan. Now, there's a lot of work that goes into that, because it's, how do you know what to track? What's the right thing to track? Do you want to track a button click on or do you want to track a user behavior? And in almost all cases, it's the latter. It's the user behavior that you want to be tracking, not the UI interactions or whatnot. And
Yes.
so when you start by like actually getting on paper or using Avo, or what your tracking plan is, you can also bring in stakeholders, and they can also see it and touch it and have some effect into it. That's like this, in terms of being proactive, that is the number one thing you can do, because one of the reasons why I think a front end or back end engineer really does not like doing this is because of kind of the ambiguity of it all. They don't really understand what the right property is or why it's being used, and so they just want to get it done and move on to the next thing. And with a tracking plan, it removes a lot of that ambiguity, and it also makes it really kind of procedural and easy to write the code. If you can, you might even be able to generate the code. I know Avo has a really great code generation feature. And so if you're making it really easy for people, they're not going to see it as a chore. And if they're not going to see it as a chore, then they're going to be more open to seeing the potential value for them. And it's like, oh, by the way, did you know this thing you did here? If you're interested in, understanding the effect of the product work that you're doing, well, you could actually go over into mixed panel amplitude and actually see people using your feature that you just released. And I know I love seeing people use my stuff, and so now all of a sudden you've created an advocate.
I think this is such a key. So to sort of sum up an answer to how do we educate people that they should care about the process of how the data is created, I think this is it boils down to bring people into the incentive of why we should be tracking.
Yeah.
So instead of assigning a ticket to someone to track the release for the onboarding process or to implement an analytics event, bring them into like, what are we trying to measure? What are we trying to accomplish with this release? And why do we want to measure that? And one of my favorite processes literally to implement for this was we called it purpose meeting at QuizUp, sorry. And we've sort of I think there's even like we recently released a Reforge artifact around the purpose meeting that we created there. We do that all the time at Alvo, and a lot of our customers have adopted it. And it's this sit-down meeting, cross-functional sit-down meeting of a data person, a product person, and the engineers that are implementing the feature. And together, this group aligns on what are the metrics that measure the success. But before that, even, what is the goal of the release from the user perspective? And then what are the metrics? And then what, if any, data changes do we need to be able to measure that?
Yeah.
And this was one of my favorite points to sort of bring up A/B testing, if that is ever helpful, because I think it's important to never force teams into A/B testing, because if they aren't inspired or incentivized to do it, they won't even use the results, and like they've decided what the best thing is. And so usually an A/B test won't help there. But what I liked to do there, for example, was like, okay, so let's say we want to measure the day one retention based on whether people saw the chat screen or not. What if this collapses when we release it? Will we then roll back the feature? And they'll be like, oh no, I mean, because that could have been just because like a marketing campaign brought a bunch of new users in that were really shit, or it could have been because we shipped a new topic or like a new subsection of a game that just wasn't as good. So no, we wouldn't roll it back. So like just introducing that, like, what would you do if the metric went down?
Yes.
I feel like
it's one of my soapboxes at work is when someone asks me how do we know that we're driving towards the right outcome? Like, well, do a thought experiment, and it's exactly what you said is what action would you take if you had this thing in front of you and it went up, went down? What action would you take? And if you can't answer that, or if the answer is you would do the same thing either way, then you've got a pretty good indication that you're not gonna drive any value by by either doing that work on that dashboard or measuring this particular thing, because you're going to do it either way, and let's not spend our time there.
Yeah, sometimes basically things are they sort of sometimes we release things because they need to be released as a part of a bigger journey, or they just we know we need to measure. But there is always something to be asked in the data, I feel like. But I think this is also an anecdote of like, it's really important that we can't really just follow the data blindly. I think that's also a thing. But I think this is also a good question. Who should be the main driver of this kind of a data culture shift in the company?
That's a good question. You know, I think there's a separation between the driver and perhaps the sponsor, right? So the different like the sponsor really should be as high up as possible. Like it needs to be a bottom down leadership sponsorship to indicate to the organization that this is important and we're willing to spend time and therefore money on this issue. But you don't want necessarily to have, your executives being the one actually driving it. So it has to be someone who is in the position to have, director or VP level relationships with other teams. So they need to be able to have the ability to bring in, the head of engineering as an advocate for data quality. So like, let's say you're in the position where you are the director of data. You need to be building relationships with the director of engineering or VP of engineering or whatever that level is. And same thing with the, ultimately stakeholders. Like, so if it's marketing, that's really driving a lot of the analytics needs, which quite often is. Then you need to be having a relationship. You need to be a bridging. You need to be that connective tissue between the producers and the consumers of the data. Because ultimately you are going to be in the middle of it all. If you try and perhaps make the shift, at the engineer level, you might get them, interested, but they're not always in charge of their priorities. The backlog, the product team, the product manager, whoever is ultimately in control of what goes in and out of the sprints is ultimately in charge of what gets prioritized. And what gets prioritized is really the thing that is going to get the most attention. If you want data quality and to have the attention of the organization, you need to have the buy-in from the people who are setting the priorities.
Exactly. I think that's sort of like, how do you get the buy-in? So you need to create incentive from the people that have the power to prioritize. Another thing that I often also like to highlight is sort of find an advocate. I think my answer to this is anyone can be the driver. But if you are in the position where you feel the need or have the job to drive this, then I think a really important first step is to sort of build an internal case study, and then build a flywheel from there.
Yes.
So something like what I like to advise, for example, if you're an analyst or like a data practitioner internally, and you need to do something about this, just because like everyone is blaming you for this, but you don't have any control of it. What I like to advise people is sort of start by finding an ally. So it all comes back to sort of building that relationship. Find like a data curious engineer, find a data curious product manager, ideally working together, and start a trio with those folks, and sort of start working this way with them on every feature release. Start with a small release. Don't start with like your company-wide KPI or your North Star metric, because it will just take a heavy lift to actually make sure the data quality is reliable for those big kind of metrics. So start with like a smaller one, start with a small group of people, and see if you can sort of show it the rest of the people like, hey, wow, they've started this great process. It's easier. They're telling this great narrative with the data. And I feel like this is sort of like a good way to start. And then ultimately, eventually, more people will become data curious.
Yeah, I like that approach. It ultimately comes back to making other people's lives easier and easier for them to implement because you've already shown them what the process is.
Yeah, I think that's a great, good point. And having said that, maybe one of our final questions can be sort of what, well, as an intro question into that, what are the, just to sum it up, what are the advantage of fixing data quality issues upstream at the source versus fixing them later in the modeling versus and the transformation stage?
You don't have, well, so I guess what is the advantage for which individual? The advantage for the data practitioner is that uh, your work is going to be able to live a lot longer. The more you fix in modeling, you're decreasing the lifespan of the work that you've done, because it's going to accumulate to a point where it has to be ripped out and replaced.
Yeah.
And so if we want to really have that longevity, then we have to be forcing it to be fixed in upstream. And the more the more pressure you put, or at least maybe that's the wrong lens, the simpler you make it for them to not only fix, but then also maintain and implement net new things with high quality data quality upstream, the easier that will get over time, and you'll create a flywheel where it just becomes table stakes for people to be implementing their instrumentation, and with a high degree of quality and rigor. I think you have to show the person who's implementing, or the team that's implementing it upstream, the benefit for them hopefully is that they can actually use this to improve their product.
Yeah, exactly. And rely less on that single data person that knows what's happening in the model that fixed it somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay, so to end this on the bright notes, like what are the outcomes that the data team can expect when they invest in this type of data quality? What is their light at the end of the tunnel?
High quality of life.
Honestly.
You are able, so I use the analogy, you're driving on the highway, and when you're staring at the tail lights in front of you, you're being highly reactive. Sometimes when you're in that state, you have no choice other than to really just look very, very like right in front of your nose, and that's it. When you have like basically a clear highway and you're able to look, a kilometer down the road, it's easier, it's calmer. You're able also to be more strategic in the work that you do and the outcomes that you do. It's fun. You're sitting in meetings where we're talking about product changes that are coming down the pipeline, and instead of thinking of how on earth are we going to fit this into this mess, like I'm just thinking about all the work that I'm gonna have to do in order to do this, you're thinking, oh yeah, that's no problem. And now you're able to deliver high quality results to the stakeholders, and they're thanking you rather than being angry with you. It's blue skies, it's fun. It's why we got into all this in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when you are able to find that balance of, like, when you're able to invest in data quality upstream, you free up so much of your time downstream. And this brings me to, and I think I've shared this with you. One of my personal missions of starting Avo is create a world with less miserable or fewer miserable data scientists. And I just, the early days for me at QuizUp, they were filled with this kind of like reactive mode and frustration everywhere. And then once we built this foundation, finally we had time to focus on all the things that we had always wanted to do. All of the cool AI stuff. And like,
looking for like new things that no one's thinking about.
Yeah, exactly.
You have time for all that.
Having said that, I always recommend, even if you are in like heads down trying to pay down data debt, and you're just forced to be really reactive, I think one of my top recommendations to anyone on any data team is always try to make sure you reserve at least an afternoon for just being proactive, an afternoon every single week, you know, just for proactive work. Nice. Is there any final piece of advice that you can give to a data practitioner that is sort of starting on their journey to better data?
Just question the status quo. You know, just because that's the way things were done, is that the way you need to do them? And if you can make the case for triaging, if you look in your your taxonomy and you've got 200 different events, if 99% of them are not being used, just triage them. Like they're not useful, get rid of them. And then now all of a sudden you have more space to focus on the things are actually mission critical.
Nice. Love it. Thank you so much for joining me here today, Drew. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
And I already look forward to our next session, whatever it will be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you everyone for joining. I'll see you soon.